Hello, and welcome to Marriage Matters. I'm Dr. Mark.
And I'm Liz, and we're your marriage and communication coaches, here to inspire you, instill hope, and empower you to work through the difficult challenges in your married life, with a little help from some guest experts and real people like you.
Today's guest is Reverend Dr. Michael Barry, and we're thrilled to have him. Reverend Barry received his Master's of Divinity from the Princeton Theological Seminary, and subsequently his Doctor of Ministry degree from Fuller Theological Seminary. He was the pastor of many churches before becoming the director of pastoral care at the Cancer Treatment Centers of America in Philadelphia, where I had the absolute pleasure and honor of working with Reverend Barry. Dr. Barry has written 4 books, including The Forgiveness Project, and has been interviewed on CNN, Fox News, CBN, as well as hundreds of radio and other television stations. Currently, Dr. Barry serves as the co-director of the Forgo Forgiveness Education Program at Luther College in Iowa.
Welcome, Reverend Barry.
Great to be with you, Liz and Mark. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thanks for being here.
It is an absolute honor. And you know, what we're going to be talking about today, forgiveness, is really so important. You've written that unforgiveness is equivalent to emotional suffocation. So what is forgiveness, and why is being unforgiven so destructive to human beings?
Well, the easiest way to define forgiveness, at least in terms of the way I think about it, is by having a handle on what we mean by unforgiveness. Unforgiveness is the retention of negative emotions. When you have been the victim of other people's harm, you typically have certain emotional feelings toward that situation and a person. And so unforgiveness is the retention of these negative emotions. Now, Mark and Liz, I think it's really important to be clear in terms of what emotions that we're talking about. When you read most literature about forgiveness or unforgiveness, they typically will have a cocktail of negative emotions. It'll include hatred and anger and revenge and guilt and shame and all these various negative emotions. That's not the way I think about it. And if we're going to use words to describe emotions, I think that we need to be as clear as possible, because at the end of the day, you know, my clients want to know what forgiveness feels like. And so I've distinguished 2 basic emotions that we feel. We typically feel anger and hatred. When I talk about unforgiveness, I'm referring primarily to the emotion of hatred, and here's why. We can be angry at a child, but not hate them. Those are 2 very different emotions and responses. Anger is the feeling we feel whenever we feel powerless about doing something. Hatred is when we typically want to cause harm, directed toward ourselves or other people, and or we choose to avoid, we run away, the fight or flight. So when I talk about unforgiveness, the primary emotion that I'm trying to neutralize is hatred. Anger can be a very constructive emotion. Anger is the feeling we feel whenever we want to right a wrong. So if there is a problem in a relationship, and let's just use a kind of an exaggerated hypothetical. Let's say, for example, there's domestic violence involved. I would never encourage the victim to not be angry. I would encourage them to forgive, but I would not in any way, shape, or form encourage them to not seek whatever justice aspects might be related to it. So when I talk about unforgiveness, the primary emotion that I'm trying to deal with is hatred. Hatred destroys everything it touches, from relationships to communities to our physical health. So unforgiveness for me, or forgiveness rather, is trying to neutralize feelings of hatred. A long answer to a good question.
Well, but that's really important for people to understand. So thank you for being so clear about that. As you know, our show really focuses on married and committed couples. So how might practicing forgiveness help a semi-healthy couple, let's say, because I know before you were talking about domestic violence, let's talk about a healthier couple, to have their marriage stay resilient and vibrant?
Well, let me speak to my own marriage. I've been married for 46 years. We dated for 5 years before that, so I've been married my whole life. I think I understand the bumps and grinds and difficulties that couples feel. Forgiveness has made a huge difference in our life. There are times in which we find ourselves at odds over various things. And because I'm able to distinguish between hatred and anger, there's very little hatred that has cropped up. I don't want to, there's very few times that I want to avoid her because of some emotional situation that might have transpired. And recognizing that anger can be a very constructive emotion, then it allows us to enter into some sort of conflict resolution aspect to try and resolve whatever those anger issues are. So there's a lot of times that people might consider it to be a forgiveness issue. We don't. And instead of avoiding dealing with difficult situations, we will do our best to dive into it. So the more forgiving you are, the more resilient you're going to be in your responses. Again, it's I hate to parse out these two emotions so cleanly, but again, words are important, and when we try and use them to describe emotions, I think it's essential that we're as clear as possible. Learning how to forgive is going to create a resilient relationship because you're going to have some coping skills on how to deal with difficulty.
Ooh, that's good. Coping skills.
That is so important. It really, really is.
That's one of the things that we work with our couples on, because coping skills are really what helps keep a marriage together. And you said something earlier about anger too, and I know when we originally had a conversation a couple weeks ago, that it's okay to get angry. I mean, I think that people think that anger is a bad thing, but it's important to be able to be angry sometimes.
It's also very important to, as you were sort of saying, to come to a viewing point. We all have points of view. It's that 6 and the 9. And if you're only looking at it as a 6, your spouse is only looking at it as a 9, you can't see, you can't communicate. As soon as you come to a viewing point and see both, you can have a discussion, you can then cope, you can figure out how to solve the problem. Reverend, again, when we're looking at forgiveness, what are the 4 ways that being forgiven or giving forgiveness to someone actually benefits an individual or that couple?
Well, another way of answering that question, Mark, would be to take a look at the motivation to want to forgive. Before I wrote my book, I contacted Fred Luskin from Stanford University, one of their country's premier forgiveness experts. And when I called him, I said, I'm thinking about writing a book. He says, no, there doesn't need to be any more books written about forgiveness. What needs to be written is a book motivating people to want to forgive. And he's exactly right. And of course, being a pastor, I'm thinking, well, the Bible's there. That's pretty good authority in that regard. But to his point, finding the motivation to forgive is always the hardest aspect of anything related to change. Getting motivated to want to do it, whether it's battling alcohol or whatever it is, finding the motivation. So what we've learned is that there are 4 primary motivators. Well, there's probably more than that, but some that were the most common is what I refer to as being biology, sociology, theology, and then thanatology, which means death and how people want to resolve some things before they cross over into the life beyond. So real quickly, biology motivates us to want to forgive because we just intuitively realize that it's making us sick. We don't feel good. And being able to forgive is going to help us feel better. Sociology means that some of our relationships are not what they could be, and so they're motivated to forgive so that their life might be re-peopled differently and bring people back into your life with whom you might have had some distance. Theology means that you sense that your unforgiveness is inhibiting your relationship with your God, and so forgiveness is a way to kind of restore that as well as relationships with other people. So those are the 3 primary motivators, and each one of those have distinct benefits.
Understood. When you and I worked together, Reverend Barry, I was at that time a physician, and I'm always interested in the biology, and few people really understand the biologic benefits of forgiveness. Could you take a moment and let our audience know the ways that forgiveness actually impacts our body?
Well, unforgiveness creates a state of chronic anxiety. Chronic anxiety produces stress, which produces cortisol in our system, which depletes the body's ability to produce natural killer cells, which is the body's foot soldier in the fight against cancer. Now, I need to be clear, certainly with someone with your background, I am not suggesting that unforgiveness causes cancer. There is no one that would connect those dots. What I am saying is that to the extent that you are living your life in a state of chronic anxiety, it's going to create a really good environment for bad things to happen. I mean, for example, chronic stress can help you be much more susceptible to the common cold. So the biology of chronic stress is pretty straightforward, and it impacts our guts. We're filled with stress. Our digestive system doesn't work. Our hearts are impacted by that as well. It affects virtually every aspect of our physical well-being. So helping people learn how to forgive can certainly ameliorate some of those kind of very obvious biological mechanisms.
That really is amazing when you think about it. I've never connected it to forgiveness, but certainly for sure, I can speak for myself when I'm feeling anxious or stressed, and it does. It affects the gut, like you said. It just you just don't feel good.
Well, Liz, real quickly, how do you feel when you hate someone?
Awful.
When you say, "Oh, I hate you," just think about how your body is feeling at that moment.
Yeah. No, I mean, your shoulders tense up. Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but yes, you're right. It is a physical. It's a physical feeling, and if we can learn better to incorporate forgiveness into situations that are causing us stress, hey, I'm going to try it because I think that's an incredible way to look at things. Instead of just solving a problem, it's also maybe thinking, why don't we forgive the person who we feel that has wronged us?
So this is great. We're going to take a break for a couple of commercials. When we come back, we're going to be talking about exactly how marriage and forgiveness impact not only the family, but the culture.
The election is right around the corner. RVN TV encourages you to register and vote. To get information about how to register and the different methods to vote this election season, visit vote.gov. Every vote counts, so don't delay.
Welcome back, and today we're here with Reverend Dr. Michael Barry, and we're talking about the importance of forgiveness. Forgiveness is not only important in a marriage, but we frequently think about how we interact with others in a loving fashion and how that impact literally compounds across time. When we impact one other life positively, it impacts others, and it goes out, and we have a huge impact on society. So, Reverend, if you don't mind, could you let us know your thoughts on applying forgiveness between a couple and how there's actually a ripple effect that goes out into other relationships in the community and the importance of that?
Yeah, probably the best story that I have in that regard is helping a woman at our cancer hospital forgive her ex-husband. She hated him with a perfect hatred. And fortunately, I was able to help her finally forgive her ex-husband, but in the meantime, it had a tremendous impact upon her children. She got custody of the two kids, and her children did not want to be around Mama because of the way she felt about their dad. And so the ripple effects in her life impacted her kids. At the very time that she needed the most social support, she found herself being fairly isolated by the feelings that she had toward her ex-husband. And so when she was finally able to forgive her ex-husband with a true forgiveness from the heart, she had an emotional shift in terms of how she viewed her ex-husband and all that she had done. She reached the point where she could even invite him and his new wife to birthday parties, Christmas things. I mean, it was a total emotional transformation. But what happened is that her son wrote as his senior thesis in high school a paper entitled "My Mom, My Hero," where he described his mother's forgiveness of their dad and how he held her in the highest esteem for being able to do that. I mean, the ripple effects, Mark and Liz, if you think about it, it's not going to be only affecting that young man. But it's also going to affect that young man and his relationships and his kids. And I can't help but think that sheer act of grace of forgiving her ex-husband is going to ripple throughout their social system for years to come. So, I mean, that's just such a powerful way to demonstrate how when we feel hatred in our own hearts, it affects people around us. Mm-hmm. Who wants to hang around somebody who's always angry and hate-filled all the time? So we have a way of socially isolating ourselves, and hatred, as I said earlier, damages everything it touches, including interpersonal relationships.
So this may be, I don't know if this is a dumb question or not, right? How do you get people to practice forgiveness? If you have so much anger towards somebody, so much hate towards somebody, what is it that you do to help the people that you're working with to really practice it and get to that point where that woman was, where she was actually able to forgive?
Well, from her standpoint, her motivation came through her faith. She was a Christian, and the more that we were able to talk about what the Bible says about it and so forth, she found that she really it's something that she needed to do. And of course, she was a late-stage cancer patient, so she also had some additional motivation. One of the things that I learned in working with cancer patients is that to the person, they want to make peace with God, with themselves, and with other people. And any way you slice that, it's a forgiveness-related question. So as the chaplain in a cancer hospital, forgiveness was virtually a topic that everybody had in common, that they were working with at some level or another. So from her standpoint, it was finding the motivation to forgive. For others, it's because of the sociology of it. They want their life repeopled differently. And for others, it's physical. So the challenge, Liz, is to try and find what is going to motivate them to want to forgive. I can be the best teacher in the world, but if people don't want to learn, it doesn't matter. Yep. The motivation has to come from the patient, and that's where you start.
That makes a ton of sense. You're absolutely right. That's how anything happens. It's you have to want to make a change. So when we were talking on the phone a couple weeks ago, you were talking about forgiveness and connecting it to nations in South Africa. And so we are talking about marriages and the impact of forgiveness on marriages, but it's also powerful enough to change the course of history. Can you tell us your thoughts on forgiveness and how it's changed nations?
Well, if you think about it, a family or a marriage is kind of a microcosm of culture. It's the smallest unit of a culture. It expands from that to a family, and from that to the relationships that you have at work and so forth. So at the micro level, it takes place in a marriage. At the macro level, it takes place in a culture. And I had the opportunity to go South Africa a couple of times. and had the privilege of meeting with somebody who was on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You might recall that when Nelson Mandela came out of prison, he was touting forgiveness for their culture. And he, along with Desmond Tutu, were able to create the Truth and Reconciliation. The point is that what kept Africa from collapsing into the bloodshed that so many other African countries experienced, including Nigeria. There were millions of people killed in Nigeria, murdered. What kept South Africa from collapsing into that mayhem? It was forgiveness. Now, it's not a perfect solution. It hasn't solved all of the problems in the world, but I can assure you, and my colleagues on the TRC will assure you, that forgiveness was what helped South Africa remain resilient, so that instead of collapsing into mayhem, they were able to find some reasonable solutions to the problems that they were having in their culture. I see absolutely no difference between what happened at the macro level in South Africa and what can take place in our marriages, especially the time during COVID-19, when we all know the stressors of, I think filings for divorce are up 30% in the last six months or so. So, it's having a tremendous kind of microwave effect upon our marriages. And I think it makes it all the more important that you develop some coping skills, which I think has to begin with forgiveness.
Michael, that's really, I think, a very important point. And going back to Nelson Mandela, he had a choice, and he was told he was going to be released from prison. F.W. de Klerk was coming in, and he had a choice, and he had a choice in that to move out and to take vitriol and hatred with him, and nobody would have blamed him for that, or to step back and to come about this as in a manner of peace and, as you said, forgiveness. Because of that, the nation was able to move forward. Lives were saved. In the moments of our decision, our destiny is forged, and that deciding is so important, whether it's a marriage or whether it's on the national or global stage. Do you find people have hurdles or blocks in coming to the ability? They know they need to make the decision, they know they need to decide to forgive, but they have a hard time actually initiating or executing on making that decision. And how do you get them through that?
Well, I look at forgiveness as being a journey. It begins with a decision to forgive, and it ends when there has been an emotional transaction that takes place in your heart. You feel differently. Now, that's not just my, theological viewpoint. That's basically the consensus of all secular scholars. It begins with a decision to forgive, and it doesn't end until something has changed emotionally, a change of our heart toward the perpetrator. Once you can commit yourself to the concept or the metaphor of a journey, the question then is, what are the barriers that you're going to face along the way? And there are some very, predictable barriers, very common ones. One is forgiving and forgetting. And some people think that just because you can still remember what happened, you haven't forgiven. And what we teach is that chances are you're never going to forget. It's a little bit like a glass of water. You drop some ink in it. That ink represents pain, and the glass represents a memory. When you stir those up, you have a painful memory. When you forgive, the ink comes out of the water. The pain is removed, but the memory remains. So it's like a scar. You can have a scar on your arm that doesn't hurt anymore. You're never going to forget how that wound got there, but it doesn't hurt anymore. So that's one of the more common misunderstanding, is to think forgive and forget. I teach you never going to forget, but you can forgive and let that pain go away. Another very common one is the justice. Some people think to forgive somebody means that they are absolving themselves of any right to justice seeking. What we teach is that justice is important. People need to be held accountable for their behavior. There are logical consequences for wrongdoing, but that doesn't mean that you have to hate the person. You can forgive them while still holding them accountable for their behavior. So those are a couple of more common common misconceptions about what forgiveness is and what it's not.
So it almost sounds like it's sort of freeing. I mean, that's what I'm getting from it. I mean, yes, you might be left with a scar because you're not going to forget. Completely agree with that. I think it is hard to forget when somebody has wronged you. But to be able to, sort of forgive and sort of just take that weight off of your back, it sounds like that is where you're getting at here. That it's allowing space to move forward. It almost sounds like if you can't forgive, you're almost stuck a little bit.
Yeah, Liz, before I run out of time, I want to make sure I make one point, and that is the most common barrier that we find in helping people find forgiveness is what I refer to as self-righteousness. When we have been the victim of someone's meanness, we assume a position of moral superiority. We're pointing the finger at them and saying, "You're bad for hurting me," which is another way of saying, "I'm good." We assume this position of moral superiority. And of course, the way that I teach forgiveness education is that, yes, we might have been the victim of someone's harm, but that doesn't mean that we in our lives have never perpetrated harm. What we teach is that everyone is a victim of other people's meanness, but we are also perpetrators as well. So as long as we're in this position of moral superiority or self-righteousness, it's very hard to look with any level of empathy or concern or desire to want to forgive. Mm-hmm. It's only when you can kind of come off that pedestal and realize that you're human just like everyone else and everybody makes mistakes, that you can at least then begin to have a reasonable dialogue and seek some reasonable solutions.
That is a wonderful way to actually end the show, because we are at the end, and we just want to thank you so much, Reverend Barry, for being here with us today. And we'd like to offer you a minute to tell our viewers how they can find you.
Well, you can look up WeDoForgiveness.com. That will take you to some of the work we've been doing at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, where they have actually a group of students who have a think tank there on forgiveness education. So that'd be a good place to start.
That's fantastic. Well, this has been an absolutely fantastic episode. We have all gained so much insight from you, Reverend Barry, and we're so grateful for that. We look forward to being with you all next week. And in the meantime, you can get in touch with us by reaching out to through. Alternatively, you can also reach us at marriagemattershosts@gmail.com. And we look forward to seeing you again next week. Have a great day.
Bye.